tonight we're going to study one of the most tragic and disturbing stories in the entire Bible. This episode is recounted in the 11th chapter of the book of Judges, and it centers around the complex personality of someone named Yiftach. This chapter from the book of Judges is actually read as the Haftorah to the weekly Torah portion of Chukat, which is found in the book of Numbers, chapters 19 through 21. We know that when the Jewish people were prohibited by their oppressors from reading the weekly Torah portion from the 5 books of Moses on Shabbat mornings, the sages instituted that we read a selection from the prophetic books of Scripture that would correspond thematically with the Torah portion that had been preempted. In the Torah portion of Chukat, the Israelites are approaching the borders of the Promised Land after wandering in the desert for 40 years after they leave Egypt. And in chapter 21 of the book of Numbers, Moses sent messengers to Sichon, who was the Amorite king, asking permission to pass through his land. They were not interested in waging war against the Amorites, but they needed to get through their land in order to reach the land of Canaan. Not only did Sichon refuse this permission, he had his armies attack the Israelites, and empowered by God, we destroyed his armies and took possession of his lands. The Torah informs us that these lands originally belonged to the Moabites, but were conquered and taken over by the Amorites. We're told in the Torah that God did not want us to attack or to fight against the Moabites. We were not supposed to fight against the Ammonites because these were descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. And we didn't attack Moab, and we didn't attack Ammon, but we did end up with land that had been theirs, but had been taken over by the Amorites. Centuries later, the Ammonites sought to take these lands back from Israel. And as we shall see, Yiftach was the Israelite leader at that time who ended up disputing their claim to this land. Before Yiftach came on the scene, the book of Judges describes the terrible spiritual corruption of the Israelites and how they had betrayed the Almighty by worshiping numerous foreign deities. They were deeply engaged with various idol worships, and God would repeatedly punish them by causing their neighbors to oppress them. And this was a pattern that we see running throughout the book of Judges, that the Israelites betray God, God sends enemies to oppress them, the Israelites cry out to God for help, they promise never to stray again, and God sends various saviors to rescue them from their enemies. Prior to Yiftach assuming the role of leader, Israel was brutally oppressed by the Ammonites for 18 years and suffered terribly from this subjugation. Israel cried out to God to save them, and he finally sent this hero, Yiftach, to deliver them from their enemies. Who was Yiftach? Yiftach's family was from the tribe of Manasseh, and they lived on the east side of the Jordan River. They lived on the Transjordan, not in the land of Israel proper. Yiftach was the firstborn son to a man named Gilad. And the Torah tells us, the book of Judges tells us, that Yiftach's mother was a Zonah. And this word has several possible meanings. Normally, it refers to a prostitute, to a harlot. It may also mean that Yiftach's mother was a concubine and not Gilad's actual wife. And some commentaries suggest a third possibility, that what is meant here is that she wasn't a concubine, she wasn't a harlot, but she was from a different tribe. She wasn't from the tribe of Manasseh, and that was considered less than an ideal marriage. We're told in the Bible that Gilad later fathered a number of sons from his main wife. And when these sons got older, they resented Yiftach. He was, of course, their oldest brother. He was the firstborn. But they considered his mother to be less than legitimate. And they did not believe that Yiftach should be entitled to inherit anything from their father. And so we're told that they drove him out of the family. The elders of that area did not support Yiftach in this quarrel, and we're told that he fled to a land called the land of Tov. The word Tov means good. In Hebrew, it's a sort of strange name for a land, especially a land that he's living in under less than good circumstances. And there we're told he attracted a crowd of low men, people of low character, and they were tough men, and they formed a militia, and they would support themselves from raids that they carried out against Israel's enemies. They collected the booty from these raids, and Yiftach gained a reputation as being a strong and brave fighter, and this reputation began to spread. As the tribe of Manasseh was experiencing continued terror from the Ammonites, a delegation of leaders, elders, came to Yiftach, and they appealed that he should lead their forces to defend them against the Ammonites. And Yiftach rebuffed them. And he reminded them that they didn't stick up for him when he was being driven out of his father's house. And now they just seemed desperate because of the attacks of the Ammonites. And the elders said that if he agrees to lead them in their fight against the Ammonites, not only will he be their military leader, they promised him that they'll make him the head of the clan. And ultimately, he was confirmed as the shofet of that generation, as the leader of the entire nation. Interestingly, instead of immediately launching an attack against the Ammonites, Yiftach sent a delegation to the king of Ammon seeking a diplomatic solution rather than having to go to war. And the Ammonites explained that the Israelites stole their territory. They stole their land that was on the east side of the Jordan River, as the Israelites were on their way toward the land of Canaan hundreds of years earlier. And the Ammonites said that they want this land back. When you read these stories in the Bible, they resonate so strongly with current events. And Yiftach responded by insisting that this claim was totally bogus. He reviewed the history of what the Torah recounts happened hundreds of years earlier, back in the book of Numbers, chapter 21. And he reviewed how the Israelites most certainly did not attack the Edomites, they did not attack the Moabites, and they did not attack the Ammonites, even though these nations would not allow them to travel through their territory on their way to the land of Canaan. Instead, the Israelites were forced to take a long detour toward the land of the Amorites, ruled by Sichon. And the Amorites as well refused to allow Israel to pass through their land, and they launched an attack against the children of Israel. And we're told that God delivered the Amorites into the hands of the Israelites, and we destroyed their armies and took over their land. Now again, some of that land of the Amorites, which was presently occupied by the tribe of Manasseh, had at one point been taken from the Ammonites by the Amorites. But Israel definitely did not steal the land Israel did definitely not steal this land from the Ammonites. Israel was attacked by the Amorite forces of Sichon and had every right to take their land after vanquishing them in battle. And Yiftach protested to the Ammonites and said that we never wronged you in any way. We never wronged you at all. And so it was simply wrong for you. It's wrong for you, the Ammonites, to be making these kinds of outrageous claims and attacking us 300 years later. Unfortunately, the king of Ammon refused to accept any of Yiftach's cogent arguments, and he refused to withdraw his troops. Yiftach was left with no choice. He marshaled his forces to attack the Ammonites. At this point, Yiftach, seeking God's help, makes a fateful vow. In Judges chapter 11, verse 30, we're told that Yiftach swore an oath to God. If you will deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return safely from the Ammonites shall be God's, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. The Midrash, the Rabbinic Midrash, in Genesis Rabbah, observes that there were 4 people in history who made improper requests. 3 of these people, we're told, were fortunate in that even though they expressed themselves improperly, God answered them kindly. The 4th person, we're told, was not so fortunate. These 4 people were Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, Kalev, Shaul, King Saul, and Yiftach. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, said when he was sent on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac, he came to the well in the center of town, and he said, and it will be that the girl who says, not only will I give you water to drink, I will also water your camels. Eliezer said, this girl will marry my master's son. And the Midrash says that this was not an appropriate kind of request. It was not an appropriate test. Because someone totally unworthy and beneath Isaac may have met Eliezer's conditions. It may not have been someone who was appropriate for Isaac. She may have been kind to offer to give Eliezer and his camels water, but there could have been a whole slew of reasons why she would be unfit as a wife for Isaac. But the Midrash says, fortunately, God sent Rebekah. The next person is Kalev, and he promised to give his daughter in marriage to the person who would capture the city of Kiryat Sefer. And we find this in the book of Joshua, chapter 15, verse 16. Now, Kalev didn't know what kind of person would conquer the city. He makes this request that whoever conquers the city, I will give him my daughter as a wife. It could have been a thoroughly boorish person who would conquer the city. This would not be an appropriate match for his daughter. But fortunately, we're told, it was Asniel ben Kenaz, a great man, who conquered this city. And then there was King Shaul, King Saul, who promised his daughter to the person who would kill the giant Goliath. And we find this story in the first book of Samuel, chapter 17. And again, the Midrash says this was not a well thought out promise. It could have been a slave who would kill Goliath, or it could have been someone else who was inappropriate for the king's daughter. But once again, God was kind, and it was David who killed Goliath. The fourth person the Midrash talks about who asked inappropriately, but who was not answered kindly by God, was Yiftach. Yiftach vowed to sacrifice to God whatever would come out of his house if he would return victoriously against the Ammonites. And this vow was considered rash. It was considered inappropriate. And the Midrash says, what if a dog came out of his house, or a pig? He can't offer that as a sacrifice to God. Those are not acceptable sacrifices to God. What kind of oath did he make? And we will see the tragic result of his oath. So after the bizarre promise that Yiftach makes, we're told that Yiftach advanced his army into Ammonite territory, and God granted him an overwhelming victory. He conquered 20 Ammonite towns, and the Ammonites surrendered to him entirely. Now, what's interesting is that when the Haftorah to the Torah portion of Chukat is read in the synagogues on Shabbat mornings, the story ends here. When we read the story of Yiftach as the Haftorah to the Torah portion of Chukat, it ends right here with the surrender of the Ammonites to Yiftach. This is verse 33 in chapter 11 of the book of Judges. But the Haftorah omits the final 7 verses in this chapter from the book of Judges. It could be that the Haftorah doesn't contain these final 7 verses because they're not really relevant to the content of the Torah portion of Chukat. Chukat, again, was simply dealing with these efforts by the Israelites to march forward to the land of Israel, and it describes how they would approach various nations to get permission to travel through their land, and they're refused, and they finally have to have this encounter with the Amorites. And so when we read the story from the book of Judges, which is basically a recapitulation of exactly that, this is all that we read in the Haftorah. But it could be that we don't conclude this chapter 11 from the book of Judges because of the horrifying conclusion to the story. We're told there that when Yiftach returned home from his victory, it was his daughter who came out to greet him with drums and with dancing. She was his only child, we're told. He had no other sons or daughters. And when he saw her, he tore his clothing. And he says, "You are my undoing. This is going to destroy me. I made a declaration to God," Yiftach says, "and I cannot take it back." He feels stuck. And she said to him, "Father, you made a declaration to God. Do with me as you vowed, since God granted you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites." And then she said to her father, "Do this for me. Give me 2 months, and I will go to the hills to weep over my virginity, I and my friends with me." And he said, "Go," and he let her go for 2 months. She went with her friends and lamented her virginity upon the hills. And after these 2 months were up, she returned to her father, and the Bible says he carried out the oath that he had vowed, and she was never intimate with a man. And the story concludes by telling us that it became the custom in Israel for the daughters of Israel to lament the daughter of Yiftach 4 days each year. Now at this point we wonder, what actually happened? What actually transpired in this story? Did Yiftach actually slaughter his daughter and offer her up to God as a burnt offering? Is that what happened? Scripture does not come out and state this explicitly. You'll notice that it didn't say in the text that he took his daughter and he offered her as a burnt offering. All we're told is that he carried out the vow that he had made. And then it says, "and she had not been with any man." Our sages have 2 very different views about what actually happened in this story. Some maintain that he actually sacrificed her. And this is the approach taken by the Midrash and supported by the commentaries of Rashi and the Ramban, Nachmanides. But other commentaries, including Ibn Ezra, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, and others, insist that no, Yiftach did not literally sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering. That did not happen. And there are many prongs to their argument. They support this idea with several arguments. Number 1, these commentaries say that the possibility of sacrificing his daughter, or anyone else for that matter, would never have been something that Yiftach would have considered. The Torah repeatedly condemns the practice of child sacrifice as an abomination to God that God despises. A Jewish leader like Yiftach, or any Jew for that matter, would never have imagined such a disgusting act could be a way of showing gratitude for God in granting them a military victory. So these commentaries say that when Yiftach made this oath to offer up anything that comes to greet him, whatever comes to greet him, he could never have imagined, and he would never have thought to do something like this. This would not be a way that he would express thanks to God, because Yiftach would see an act of sacrificing his child and burning the child as a sacrifice to God as the most hideous, grotesque, disgusting kind of act. So these commentaries insist that when Yiftach made his vow, it contained two possible outcomes. That if you look carefully at the wording of what Yiftach says, there seem to be two possible outcomes to his vow. Number one, if a person will come out of my house, I will consecrate that person to God. That's A. Possibility A. He knew this, that if it's going to be a person that comes out to greet me, I will dedicate and consecrate that person to God. And if an animal will come out, I will offer it up as a burnt offering. And they find support for this understanding with a careful reading of the wording of Yiftach's vow, because the Hebrew can be parched in two different ways. He says, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return safely from the Ammonites shall be God's, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. So this reading of the vow basically has only one possible outcome. He's saying that whatever comes out of the house, he's going to offer it up to consecrate it to God. How will he consecrate it to God? By offering it as a burnt offering. However, this phrase, the phrase of his vow, can also be rendered in a different way. Because the Hebrew word, or it's actually the conjunctive letter vav, vav does not have to mean and in Hebrew. The letter vav can also mean or. So they read his vow in the following way. They say, he was saying that whatever comes out to greet me at the door, it shall be God's, meaning it will be consecrated to God, or I will offer it as a burnt offering. Not and I will offer it as a burnt offering. So this group of commentaries sees in the explicit language of Yiftach a dual-pronged vow, and that he never intended to literally sacrifice whoever walked out the door. Again, if it was a person that would walk out the door, he would dedicate and consecrate this person to God. We will explore momentarily what this means. But if it's an animal, then he will offer it as a burnt offering. So again, it will be God's, or I will offer it as a burnt offering. It's in one or two possibilities. So according to this view, Yiftach's daughter was not killed. She was consecrated to live a life of isolation, never to marry, and to live in seclusion dedicated only to God. And this is what Yiftach meant when he said, it will be to God. It will be God's. A kind of Jewish cloistered nun. That's how he saw the fate of his daughter. Now you can also see this view supported by the rest of the passage. When Scripture says he fulfilled his vow and she didn't know any man, that's what the text says. He did what his vow was, he fulfilled his vow, and she did not know any man. So these commentaries say this was his vow. His vow would be that she would not know any man, that she would live in seclusion and not marry and not raise a family. If you think about it, if fulfilling his vow meant that he would kill her, then what would be the point of telling us that she didn't know any man? Of course she wouldn't know any man if she was dead. That would be blatantly obvious that she didn't know any man if she was killed. Obviously, as a corpse, she could not have physical relations with any man. So the phrase that she did not know any man makes sense in the context of Yiftach sending her away to live in isolation. Another proof for this approach, again, the approach of those who insist he did not kill her, is that when Yiftach tells his daughter about his vow, what does she do? She asks for 2 months to mourn her virginity. Now, if he was going to kill her, she would have wanted to mourn for her very life. For her very life that was about to be taken from her. But this is not what she's going to cry about. Rather, she wants to cry about her not being able to live out her dreams for her life. That she would not be able to marry. That she would not be able to raise a family. That's what it means when she says, I want 2 months to mourn for my virginity, the fact that I'm going to be celibate for the rest of my life and not marry. And this is why Scripture does not say that Yiftach offered her up as a burnt offering. This is not what we're told in the text. Rather, all the text says is that he fulfilled the vow for her that he had made. There's a reason why the text doesn't say that he sacrificed her on the altar as a burnt offering. It doesn't say that, these commentaries argue, because he didn't do that. So for 2 months, she mourned for the kind of life she'd be deprived of. That she was going to be sent off to live in isolation now, living a life of celibacy, totally dedicated to God alone, living a life dedicated simply to prayer and to meditation. And 4 times a year, she would be visited by the women of Israel who would commiserate with her and bemoan her fate. So you have to realize that the Hebrew at the very end of this chapter could be read in this way, that they mourned with her, rather than saying they mourned for her. If you read the end of this chapter, that they mourned for her, you could see that maybe it means she was killed. But you could equally read this phrase to be saying they would come 4 times a year to mourn with her. She was alive, but she was living in seclusion. However, as we've mentioned, there's another view about what actually happened in this story. According to this other approach, Yiftach's vow was literally to offer as a burnt offering to God whatever came out of his door when he returned from battle. His daughter emerged, and according to this view, he sacrificed her. And afterward, The daughters of Israel didn't mourn her fate with her. They mourned for her because she was killed. Now, you have to realize that the sages of Israel were entirely sickened and scandalized by this story. This story is horribly wrong for so many reasons. Number one, any oath or vow that violates a biblical law has absolutely no validity or standing as an oath. It means nothing. And he would not be bound by such an absurd vow. For example, if you make a vow to eat 2 bacon double cheeseburgers every Monday and Thursday, it's like you said nothing. You cannot make a vow that violates a law of the Torah. And therefore, the vow has absolutely no binding force upon you. And since a human being cannot be sacrificed, if he made such a vow, if he made such an oath, it's like he said nothing. Secondly, even if something is not against the Torah, you can only obligate yourself in a vow. You can't obligate somebody else. You can make a vow that you will not watch television for the next 3 years. But you cannot make a vow for your friend that would restrict your friend from watching television for 3 years. You cannot do that in a vow. So he cannot make a vow that impacts his daughter. You can only vow to impact yourself. And finally, even if we push the envelope and say that Yiftach's vow was somehow legitimate, which it wasn't, but even if we say that it somehow was legitimate, in the Torah we have the possibility of nullifying vows. That if, when you make a vow, you were not fully aware of all of the ramifications of what it would entail, there is a legal possibility of retroactively nullifying the vow that you made. And our sages are very bothered by this. Whether we follow the first view, that he only vowed to send her into isolation, or the second approach, that he actually vowed to sacrifice her, either way, why did he go through with either of these possibilities? He could have simply had his vow annulled. This is extremely perplexing. In the text, he's very upset when his daughter comes out of the house to greet him. He obviously never considered this as a possibility. He never anticipated that she might come out of the door. It would have been a no-brainer at this point to get his vow annulled. So the Midrash fills in the unnerving story of why this did not happen. Why was it that his vow was not annulled? You're not going to find this in the text of the Bible, but the Rabbinic Midrash, which fleshes out the stories of the Bible, explains what happened. The Midrash says that the high priest at that time was Pinchas. Pinchas, who was the grandson of Aaron. And he was a great sage, a great Torah scholar. Couldn't he have nullified the vow of Yiftach? And according to the Midrash, Pinchas said to himself, he needs me. Yiftach needs me. I should go to him? Let him come to me. And Yiftach said, I should go to him? I'm the great leader and commander of the people. Pinchas should come to me. And the Midrash says that between this back and forth, Yiftach's daughter was lost. And the Midrash tells us that both of them were punished for the blood of Yiftach's daughter. The Midrash says that Yiftach's limbs fell off as he traveled around from place to place, and his limbs that dropped off of his body were buried where they fell off. How do you see this in the text? Because the text says at the end of his life, Yiftach died and was buried in the cities of Gilad. What do you mean he was buried in the cities of Gilad? A person's buried in one place. But the Midrash picks up on the fact that it says he was buried in various cities because as he was going around the cities, his limbs were falling off. They buried each limb as it fell off. That was the fate of Yiftach. And what happened to Pinchas? The Midrash says that Pinchas lost his divine inspiration. Now clearly Yiftach's arrogance here is impossible to understand, especially according to the view that takes the story literally and that he ended up sacrificing his daughter. How is this possible? His daughter's life is at stake, and this is his only child. Is it possible that it was simply his pride and arrogance that prevented him from being able to go to Pinchas to get his vow nullified? Can you imagine such a person? It's incomprehensible. Obviously, Yiftach made an impulsively foolish vow to help secure a victory over the Ammonites. But once it became clear how absurdly tragic this vow would be, how is it possible that anything would stand in the way of nullifying his vow to save his precious daughter's life? And the Midrash actually describes how Yiftach's daughter desperately pleaded with him to spare her life. In the Midrash, he says to him, does the Torah say to sacrifice people? She said, doesn't the Torah say in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 3, that you shall bring your offerings from the cattle, from the herd, or from the flock? The Torah never says to sacrifice human beings. And Yiftach pathetically responds to his daughter, I vowed that whatever comes forth from the doors of my house to greet me, I will offer it up as a burnt offering. How can I not fulfill my vow? You scratch your head. What kind of an answer is this? And his daughter said, look, father, the patriarch Jacob, our father Jacob vowed to God, whatever you will give me, I will repeatedly tithe to you. It's in Genesis chapter 28, verse 22. And she says, the Holy One, blessed is he, gave Jacob 12 tribes. Did he sacrifice any of them? But her father did not listen to her arguments because he felt that his vow to God somehow takes precedence over her life. He felt, how is it possible for him not to honor the promise that he made? In his mind, he's fixated on the idea that I made a vow, I've got to keep it. And the Midrash excoriates Yiftach's so-called idealism and desire to stand up for his understanding of spiritual values because his sense of ethics was not in line with the Torah. He feels he's being idealistic. I'm standing up for a principle. You make a vow, you keep it. And the Midrash says this is lunacy. he was trying to be righteous. But the Midrash says that because it wasn't grounded in the Torah itself, it wasn't based upon the direction that the Torah gives us for life, with wisdom and with humility, his kind of idealism can lead to the kind of tragic ending that we see in this story, where he sacrifices his only child, thinking that he's doing the right thing. After all, Yiftach is a fighter, and he thought he was fighting for principles. But we have something in the Torah called a chassid shoteh, a pious fool, the kind of person that sees a drowning woman and won't go in to save her because he says, it's not modest for me to touch this woman as she perishes drowning. This is a pious person, a foolish pious person. And that's what Yiftach is. The story shows how twisted and perverted religious zeal and idealism can be if it's not grounded in the yardstick through the lens of the Torah, of what the Torah actually teaches, as opposed to what one's own tragic and erroneous self-understanding of what they assume the Torah wants. Yiftach erroneously believed that the vow of a leader in wartime had to be upheld at all costs. This was his mishigas. This was his craziness. And it was his ignorance of the Torah that precipitated this tragedy. Now, earlier we mentioned the Midrash that spoke of 4 people who made inappropriate requests of God: Eliezer, Kalev, and Shaul, and Yiftach. The first 3 got away with it. The first 3 got away with murder and didn't suffer as a result of their words. Why were they fortunate? And why was Yiftach stuck with tragedy? One suggestion is that Eliezer, Kalev, and Shaul all trusted that God would not send them a person who was not fitting. When they made these vows, they had trust in God. Eliezer trusted in the merit of Abraham and Isaac, that God would not arrange for an improper, inappropriate mate for Isaac to offer him water at the well. And because he trusted in God, God made sure that this turned out okay. Kalev and Saul trusted that the Almighty would not arrange for an unworthy person to be the agent of salvation for Israel. And so God did not send unworthy agents of salvation. But when Yiftach carelessly and recklessly said that whatever would greet him at his door would be sacrificed, he wasn't placing his trust in God to ensure that it would turn out okay. Rather, it was a haphazard vow, a careless, haphazard vow that simply banked on chance. It wasn't trust in God. He was banking on chance that it would be okay, that it would turn out fine. He was not careful about how he chose his words, nor where he put his trust, and so God allowed this tragic event to take place. Another approach to this question: why was Yiftach somehow subject to tragedy and the other 3 people God ensured that they would be okay? Another approach to this question is that Yiftach's pledge itself involved a potential disgrace to God by involving God in the oath. As such, only he, among the 4 people discussed in the Midrash, was worthy of being punished, because Yiftach's oath involved a potential desecration of God's name if something inappropriate would end up being sacrificed to God. So in this story, even though we see that Yiftach was a great warrior and to an extent a great leader and maybe even a great diplomat, what led to his downfall in this tragic story was the deadly combination of both ignorance and arrogance. Ignorance and arrogance led to the downfall of Yiftach.